fired how to talk to women. Don't ask questions. Robert Greene, most men think that if they want to talk to a woman, they need to ask her questions. What do you do? Where are you from? Where are you from? What do you like to do? What kind of music do you listen to? And they think they're being interested. But there's a problem. The more questions you ask, the more the conversation starts to feel like an interview. And the woman starts thinking, why is this guy interviewing me? Because there's a difference between showing interest in someone and trying to extract information from them. And most men don't understand that difference. They think conversation is about gathering facts, but conversation is not really about facts. It's about emotion. It's about creating a feeling. It's about making the other person associate you with something interesting, different, and emotionally stimulating. So if you're constantly asking questions, you're putting all the responsibility for the conversation on her. You're saying, you give me something interesting, and then I'll react to it. That's not very attractive. A better conversationalist does something completely different. He makes observations. He makes statements. He tells small stories. He notices something about the person and plays with it. And most importantly, he gives the other person something to react to. Because think about the difference. If you say, what do you do for work? She gives you an answer. Marketing. Then you have to ask another question. How long have you been doing that? She answers, 5 years. Then you ask another question. Do you like it? And suddenly you've created an interrogation. But imagine instead you say, you look like someone who would absolutely hate having a boring 9 to 5. Now you've given her something. She can disagree. She can laugh. She can explain herself. She can say, actually, I love my job. And now you have a conversation. You didn't need to ask her anything. You made an observation, and that observation created tension. That's the key. Conversation needs a little bit of tension, not conflict, not aggression, but something that gives the other person a reason to respond. Because when you ask question after question, you're making everything predictable, and predictability kills curiosity. You want the person wondering, where is this guy going with this? That's what makes conversation interesting. Now, this doesn't mean you should never ask questions. Of course you should, but there's a huge difference between asking a question because you're genuinely curious and asking questions because you don't know what else to say. A lot of men fall into the second category. They meet an attractive woman and suddenly their brain goes blank. So they start searching for questions. What do you do? Where do you live? How many siblings do you have? What are your hobbies? They're desperately trying to keep the conversation alive, and the woman can feel that desperation because underneath all those questions is another message. Please like me. Please keep talking to me. Please don't let this conversation end. And that puts pressure on the interaction. The strongest conversations don't feel like someone is trying to make them happen. They feel effortless, and effortlessness comes from being present. Instead of thinking, what question should I ask next? Look at the woman. Listen to what she's actually saying. Notice the little details. Notice her energy. Notice what excites her. Notice what she complains about. Notice the contradiction between what she says and how she behaves. And then respond to that. For example, if she says, I hate people, I'm actually a very antisocial person, but she's been talking to you for 20 minutes and hasn't stopped smiling, you don't have to say, why are you antisocial? Instead, you can smile and say, that's interesting because you don't seem very antisocial right now. Now you've created something. She might laugh. She might defend herself. She might tell you a story about why she doesn't trust people. And suddenly you're no longer interviewing her. She's revealing herself. That's a completely different dynamic. And this is where psychology becomes important. People don't necessarily remember every word you said. They remember how they felt around you. If your conversation feels like an interview, she'll remember that. If it feels playful, unpredictable, and emotionally alive, she'll remember that. And this is why the man who says less can sometimes create more attraction than the man who talks constantly. Because he isn't trying to fill every silence. He's comfortable with himself. He's not desperately searching for approval. And that creates a completely different energy. There is another mistake men make. They think they need to impress a woman with information. So they start talking about their job, their achievements, their money, their connections, their accomplishments. They think if she understands how impressive I am, she'll be attracted to me. But attraction doesn't work that mechanically. If you're constantly trying to prove your value, you're actually communicating that you need her approval. Instead, let your personality come through naturally. Tell a story, make an observation, talk about something you genuinely find fascinating, have an opinion, and don't be afraid if she disagrees. In fact, disagreement can make a conversation more interesting. Imagine she says, I could never live in New York, and instead of immediately saying, why not? You say, that's exactly what someone who secretly needs New York would say. Now she has something to push against. Absolutely not. And you smile. Okay, now I'm curious. Notice what happened. You didn't interrogate her, you created a little game, and people enjoy games. They enjoy having something to react to. This is one of the most important principles in conversation. Don't constantly pull information out of people, give them something to respond to. A statement, a story, a playful challenge, a surprising opinion, a strange observation, something. Because attraction thrives on participation. Now, here's where many men go wrong. They hear this advice and think, okay, I need to tease women. And suddenly they start making insults. They think being mysterious means being rude. They think confidence means acting arrogant. That's not what I'm talking about. If you're naturally disrespectful, you're not creating attraction, you're creating discomfort. The point isn't to manipulate someone. The point is to stop behaving like you're auditioning for their approval. There's a subtle difference. You can be kind without being needy. You can be interested without interrogating. You can listen without constantly asking questions. And you can be confident without dominating the conversation. The real skill is being comfortable enough to let the conversation breathe. Sometimes she'll say something and you don't need to immediately respond with another question. You can simply react. You can laugh. You can tell a related story. You can say, that reminds me of something, and tell her a short story. Now you're contributing. You're not just extracting. Because that's what makes a conversation feel mutual. And here's another powerful principle. Don't try to reveal everything about yourself immediately. Men often think that being completely open is the same as being authentic, but authenticity doesn't mean giving someone your entire biography in the first 20 minutes. If you tell someone everything about yourself immediately, there's nothing left to discover. A little mystery is healthy. Let pieces of your personality appear naturally. Maybe she discovers that you're obsessed with old movies. Maybe she discovers that you once made a completely irrational decision that turned into a great story. Maybe she discovers that you have an unusual opinion about something. These little discoveries create curiosity, and curiosity keeps people engaged. Think about a great movie. If you knew everything about the character in the first 5 minutes, you wouldn't need to keep watching. The story works because you're constantly discovering something new. Conversation works in a similar way. You're not trying to hide yourself. You're simply not dumping your entire personality onto someone at once. There's another important point. Stop trying so hard to make her like you. Because when you're focused on whether she likes you, you stop paying attention to whether you actually like her. That's a huge psychological mistake. You're evaluating yourself through her eyes. Did she laugh? Is that a good answer? Did I say something stupid? And now you're no longer having a conversation. You're monitoring yourself. Instead, become curious about the person in front of you, not in an interrogative way, in a human way. What kind of person is she? What makes her excited? What does she care about? What makes her laugh? What contradictions does she have? What kind of world does she live in? That curiosity changes everything because now you're not performing, you're observing, and when you're observing, you're present. That's where real charisma begins. Now, there's one more thing men need to understand. Silence isn't always a problem. Sometimes the biggest mistake you can make is trying to eliminate every moment of silence. A confident person can tolerate a pause. He doesn't panic. He doesn't immediately throw out another question. He doesn't start talking about the weather because he's afraid the conversation is dying. He allows the moment to exist, and sometimes the woman will fill the silence herself. That's important because if you're always filling the space, you never give the other person a chance to move toward you. You want participation, you want reciprocity, you want her to contribute. And sometimes the best way to create that is simply to stop pushing. So if you remember only a few things from this, remember these. Don't turn conversation into an interview. Don't ask questions just because you're afraid of silence. Make observations. Tell stories. Have opinions. Play with ideas. Give the other person something to react to. And most importantly, stop thinking about how to make her like you. Start thinking about whether there's actually something interesting between the two of you. Because when you stop trying to control the outcome, you become much more relaxed. And when you're relaxed, you listen better. When you listen better, you notice more. When you notice more, you become more interesting. And when you become more interesting, you don't need to ask 20 questions just to keep someone talking. You can say one sentence and suddenly she wants to know more about you. There's another level to conversation that most men never understand. It's not about what you say, it's about what you make the other person feel while you're saying it. Because you can have the perfect words and still be completely boring, and you can say something incredibly simple and create a moment that she remembers for days. The difference is emotional energy. Most men approach a woman with one goal in their mind: I need to keep her interested. And that mindset immediately puts them in a weak position because now every response becomes a test. She laughs. Good. She doesn't laugh, panic. She gives a short answer. Now you start asking more questions. You start talking faster. You start trying harder. And the more you try to force the conversation, the more unnatural it becomes. The woman can feel that you're trying to get somewhere, and that's exactly what you don't want. You want the conversation to feel like something you're both discovering, not something you're trying to control. So here's a powerful shift. Instead of thinking, what should I say to impress her? Think, what is interesting about this moment? That one question changes the way you communicate because now you're paying attention to reality instead of performing. Maybe she says something completely unexpected. Don't immediately turn it into another question. React to it. Maybe she says, I don't really like going out. You could ask, why? But you don't have to. You could say, you're telling me you secretly enjoy sitting at home judging everyone from your couch. She laughs. Absolutely not. That's exactly what someone who does that would say. Now there's energy. You didn't need information. You created interaction. And that's a major difference. Information creates conversation. Interaction creates connection. Think about that. You can know everything about someone and still feel nothing for them. And you can have a 10-minute conversation with someone and feel like you've known them for years. Why? Because the second conversation contained emotion. It contained surprise, it contained personality, it contained tension, and that's what people remember. Now, there's another mistake men make. They listen to a woman and immediately try to solve her problems. She says, oh, my boss is driving me crazy. And the man immediately says, you should probably talk to your manager. Then he gives her 5 solutions. He thinks he's helping. But sometimes she wasn't asking for a solution. She was giving you an emotional experience. She wanted you to enter her world for a moment. So instead of fixing everything, you can simply say, your boss sounds like the kind of person who has never heard the word relax. Now you're with her. You're not analyzing her problem. You're experiencing the moment with her. This is what emotional intelligence looks like in conversation. You don't always have to solve. Sometimes you simply have to understand. And there's a deeper reason this works. People want to feel seen, not examined. There's a difference. If you ask a woman 20 questions, she may feel examined. If you notice something subtle about her personality, she may feel seen. That's much more powerful. For example, imagine she says, I've always wanted to travel, but I never actually do it. Most men will ask, where do you want to travel? That's logical. But you could say, so you're an adventurous person trapped inside a very responsible person's life. Now you've given her an identity. Maybe she'll say, that's actually exactly what I am. And suddenly she starts telling you stories, not because you interrogated her, because you gave her a way to express herself. That's the real power of observation. You don't pull information out, you create a doorway, and she chooses whether she wants to walk through it. Now let's talk about teasing, because this is where a lot of men misunderstand attraction. Teasing isn't about insulting someone. It's about creating a playful contradiction. You notice something harmless and exaggerate it. If she says, I love coffee, you don't need to say, what's your favorite coffee? You can say, so you're one of those people who can't function before the first cup. She says, maybe. You smile. I knew it. Now there's a playful dynamic. You're not trying to put her down. You're creating a little world between the two of you. And that's important because attraction often grows through shared experiences that feel slightly different from ordinary conversation. It's not just the words, it's the feeling of we have our own little joke. That's powerful. But here's the rule: never tease from insecurity. If you're teasing because you're afraid of being boring, she'll feel the tension underneath it. If you're teasing because you're genuinely amused, it's different. Again, it comes back to authenticity. You can't manufacture confidence through techniques. Techniques only amplify what's already there. If you're desperate underneath, even the perfect line will sound desperate. If you're relaxed, even a simple comment can feel charismatic. And this brings us to something even more important. Stop memorizing lines. A man who memorizes 50 things to say is still going to struggle when the woman says something he didn't expect. Because he's not listening. He's waiting for his opportunity to use his line. Real conversational ability comes from improvisation, and improvisation comes from attention. Listen to the exact words. Listen to the emotion behind them. Notice what she gets excited about. Notice what she avoids. Notice what she laughs at. Notice when her energy changes. That's where the conversation is, not in your prepared questions. And sometimes you can even use her exact words as the beginning of your next thought. She says, I've been working all week and I'm exhausted. Instead of, where do you work? You might say, you look like someone who desperately needs a weekend with absolutely no responsibilities. She might laugh. That's literally my dream. And now you have something. You can talk about what she considers a perfect weekend, her idea of relaxation, her personality, her lifestyle. And none of it required a formal interview. You're following the emotional thread. That's the skill. Now, here's something most men don't realize. A conversation becomes attractive when you stop trying to make every moment successful. Sometimes a comment doesn't land. That's okay. Sometimes she gives a boring answer. That's okay. Sometimes there is silence. That's okay. You don't need to rescue every moment, because the moment you believe every silence is a failure, you become nervous. And nervousness makes you talk too much. You start explaining yourself. You start telling stories that aren't interesting. You start asking random questions, and eventually the conversation becomes exhausting. Confidence is partly the ability to let moments exist without immediately trying to control them. That's why some people have an incredible presence, even when they're not saying much. They're comfortable. They're not rushing. They're not desperately trying to prove their value, and people naturally become curious about someone who doesn't seem to need constant validation. There's another psychological principle here. People often become more interested in you when they have to participate in discovering you. If you tell them everything, there's nothing to discover. But if you reveal yourself gradually, curiosity develops. This doesn't mean pretending to be mysterious. It means allowing a conversation to unfold naturally. You don't need to explain every opinion. You don't need to justify every decision. You don't need to tell her your entire life story. Give her pieces. Let her ask. Let her wonder. Let her discover. Because curiosity is one of the strongest forces in human psychology. Think about every story you've ever enjoyed. You keep watching because you want to know what happens next. Conversation can work the same way. Not because you're manipulating someone, but because human beings naturally want to complete incomplete information. So don't reveal everything in the first 10 minutes. Let there be another layer and another. Now, there's one final mistake I want to talk about. Men often think the goal of talking to a woman is to get her number, or get the date, or get her to like them. But if that's your entire focus, you're skipping the actual experience. You're treating the conversation like a transaction, and people can feel when they're being treated like an objective. Instead, ask yourself something much simpler. Do I enjoy talking to this person? That's it. Because the moment you genuinely become curious about whether you like her, the dynamic changes. You're no longer begging for approval. You're evaluating compatibility. You're not thinking, how do I convince her I'm attractive? You're thinking, is there something here that creates equality? And equality creates confidence. So the next time you're talking to a woman, don't walk in with 10 questions memorized. Don't think you have to entertain her every second. Don't panic when there's silence. Don't try to prove your worth. Instead, observe, listen, react, tell stories, have opinions, play with ideas, and let the conversation move wherever it naturally wants to go. Because the most charismatic person in the room isn't necessarily the person who talks the most. It's often the person who makes everyone else feel more interesting when they're around him. And that's the real secret. You don't become a great conversationalist by learning what to say. You become one by learning how to see people. Once you can see people, you'll never run out of things to talk about. There is a point in every conversation where a man can either create attraction or destroy it without realizing what he just did. And usually it isn't because he said something offensive. It's because he made the conversation predictable. He became too available, too eager, too agreeable, too easy to read. And this is something people don't understand about human psychology. We are naturally drawn toward what we don't completely understand. Think about a movie. If you know exactly what is going to happen in the next scene, you lose interest. You don't keep watching because there's nothing left to discover. The same thing can happen in conversation. If a woman can predict every response you're going to give, every opinion, every reaction, every compliment, then there is no curiosity. And without curiosity, the emotional energy begins to disappear. This is why one of the worst things a man can do is constantly agree with everything a woman says. She says, I love this. You say, me too. She says, I hate that. You say, yeah, me too. She says, I think people who do that are ridiculous. You say, absolutely. And you think you're building connection, but you're actually removing yourself from the conversation because now she doesn't know what you think. She doesn't discover anything about you. You're simply reflecting her back to herself. And that's not conversation. That's approval seeking. A man with his own personality can disagree without becoming hostile. He can say, I actually see that completely differently, and then explain why. That creates something because now there are two people in the conversation, not one person talking and another person agreeing. And here's the interesting part. You don't need to disagree just to appear confident. That becomes another form of insecurity. The goal isn't to contradict everything she says. The goal is to have your own mind. If you agree, agree because you genuinely agree. If you disagree, don't be afraid to say it. Authenticity is more attractive than performance, and that brings us to another major mistake, complimenting too much. Now, compliments aren't bad. Of course they're not. But when a man constantly tells a woman how beautiful she is, how amazing she is, how perfect she is, something subtle begins to happen. The compliment loses its value. Because if you're giving approval every 30 seconds, eventually it doesn't feel like approval. It feels like you're trying to buy hers. And women are often much more sensitive to that than men realize. A better compliment is specific, unexpected, and connected to something you actually noticed. Instead of saying, you're beautiful, you might say, you have a very mischievous smile. Now you've noticed something. You're not just repeating the most obvious thing about her. Or maybe she tells you a story and you say, you've got a very stubborn side, don't you? And she says, what makes you think that? Now you've created curiosity. She wants to know what you noticed. Again, you're not asking her 20 questions. You're giving her something to react to. That's the difference. Now let's talk about something even more important, trying to impress. This is where many men lose their natural personality. They start talking about money, their job, their accomplishments, the places they've traveled, the people they know, and sometimes they don't even realize they're doing it. They think they're telling stories, but underneath the story is a message. Look how valuable I am, and there's nothing wrong with being successful. The problem is needing someone to recognize it. A confident person doesn't need to constantly announce their value. It comes through naturally. You tell a funny story because it's funny. You talk about something you're passionate about because you're passionate about it. You mention your work because it comes up naturally. You're not waiting for her reaction to determine whether you're valuable. That is a completely different energy. And here's where conversation becomes much more psychological. People are attracted to emotional certainty, not certainty about everything, but certainty about yourself. If you constantly change your personality based on her reaction, she will feel it. If she laughs, you become more confident. If she doesn't laugh, you suddenly become quieter. If she likes your opinion, you keep giving opinions. If she disagrees, you immediately change your position. Now you're being controlled by her reactions, and that's not attractive. You need to be able to remain yourself regardless of whether every sentence gets applause. That's emotional stability, and emotional stability creates presence. Now let's talk about the biggest conversational killer of all, talking too much. A man becomes nervous. He starts telling another story, then another. Then he explains the first story because he thinks she didn't understand. Then he adds another detail, and suddenly he has been talking for 5 minutes. He thinks he's keeping the conversation alive, but he's actually leaving no room for her to enter. Remember what we talked about earlier? Conversation needs participation. So say something and stop. Let her respond. You don't need to immediately explain yourself. You don't need to fill every pause. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do after saying something interesting is simply smile and let the silence exist. Because silence creates space, and space gives the other person an opportunity to move toward you. This is also why constantly texting can destroy the mystery of a new connection. You send a message, she replies, you immediately reply. She replies, you immediately reply, and before you know it, you spent 6 hours talking about nothing. You have revealed everything. There is no anticipation, no space, no life outside the conversation. Now, this doesn't mean you should play games. You don't need to intentionally ignore someone. You don't need to calculate every response time. That's manipulation. The point is much simpler. Have a life, do your work, see your friends, pursue your interests. Don't make another person the center of your entire emotional world. Because when you have your own life, conversation becomes naturally richer. You have experiences to bring into it, stories, ideas, observations, failures, successes, things that happened that day. You're not sitting there thinking, what can I say to keep her interested? You're living. And that's one of the most attractive things a person can do. Live an interesting life. Now, there's another subtle thing that makes conversations powerful, the ability to create emotional contrast. If every sentence is serious, the conversation becomes heavy. If every sentence is a joke, it becomes shallow. You want movement. Serious, playful, curious, unexpected, back to serious, then playful again. That's what makes conversation feel alive. Think about music. If every note had the same intensity, you'd stop noticing the music. It's the changes that create emotion. Conversation works the same way. You might be talking about her work. Then you make a playful observation. She laughs. Then she tells you something personal. Now you slow down and actually listen. Then you tell a short story. Then you're joking again. That's emotional movement. And emotional movement creates memory. This is also why you shouldn't be afraid to reveal something real. Mystery doesn't mean pretending to be emotionless. It doesn't mean acting like nothing affects you. In fact, carefully chosen vulnerability can create trust. But there's a difference between vulnerability and emotional dumping. Vulnerability says, here's something real about me. Emotional dumping says, here's every unresolved problem I've ever had, and I need you to fix it. One creates connection, the other creates pressure. So if you tell a personal story, tell it because it has meaning. Maybe it taught you something. Maybe it changed how you see people. Maybe it was embarrassing but funny. Maybe it was a failure that made you stronger. These stories reveal character, and character is much more interesting than a list of facts. Now, here's a powerful test. After your next conversation with a woman, don't ask yourself, did she like me? Ask yourself, Did I actually express myself? Did you say what you genuinely thought? Did you laugh when you wanted to laugh? Did you disagree when you disagreed? Did you tell a story that mattered to you? Did you listen? Did you notice her? Or were you simply performing the version of yourself you thought she wanted? That's the real question, because you can technically succeed in getting someone's attention while completely failing to create a genuine connection. And eventually the performance becomes exhausting. You cannot maintain a fake personality forever. That's why authenticity matters so much. The goal isn't to become the perfect man who knows exactly what to say. That man doesn't exist. The goal is to become comfortable enough with yourself that you don't need a perfect sentence. You can recover from awkwardness. You can laugh at yourself. You can change the subject. You can sit in silence. You can say, I completely lost my train of thought, and smile. Nothing catastrophic happens. In fact, sometimes that imperfection makes you more human because people don't connect with perfection. They connect with something they can recognize. So stop trying to perform, stop trying to impress, stop trying to keep the conversation alive every second, and stop treating every woman like a test you have to pass. She's a person. You're a person. You're simply discovering whether something interesting exists between you. And when you approach conversation that way, something changes. You stop chasing reactions. You start creating moments. You stop asking, what should I say next? And you start thinking, what is happening right now? You stop trying to be impressive and you become present. And that's when conversation becomes effortless. Because ultimately, the secret isn't learning how to talk to women. It's learning how to stop being afraid of being yourself around them. Once you understand that you don't need a script, you don't need 20 questions, you don't need clever lines, you simply need to be present enough to notice what's already happening.